Welcome to Current Affairs. My name is Nathan Robinson. I'm the editor-in-chief of Current Affairs magazine. I am joined today by Ryan Grimm. He is the Intercept's Washington bureau chief. He also co-hosts Counterpoints as the DC bureau chief of the Huffington Post. He led their Pulitzer Prize winning reporting team. He is now the author of the new book, The Squad. Ryan Grimm, thank you so much for joining us on Current Affairs today.
It's lovely to be here.
Now let's start with, I want to ask a very basic question, which is there a squad? I assume there is because the squad is the subject of your book. But if there is a squad, what are the boundaries of the squad? Is it a self-defined unit? Is it a media-defined unit? Who and what are the squad?
There's a funny quote in the book that I'm sure you came across from Ilhan Omar where she says, there is no such thing as a squad, just so you know. Because I was asking her, do you guys have a weekly call or now in the first, say, 6 months to a year of their tenure, by there, I mean the four original members of what the media called the squad. That's Rashida, Ilhan, Ayanna, and AOC. So the staff would coordinate and they would circulate. Dan Riffle, an aide to AOC, at one point makes a reference. He said, we circulated as a squad. The first, an idea they circulated among the squad. So the first thing that they would do is say, okay, this is something we want to try legislatively or, PR-wise. What do you guys think? Are you in? So there was an idea among them, for sure, that they existed as this foursome that could act collectively. That did not by any means mean that they were an official thing, that they had bylaws, that they had regular check-ins beyond a text message chain. And it didn't mean that they were obligated to agree to go in the same direction on any issue, let alone all issues. Now, I think it's uncontroversial to say that Cori Bush and Jamal Bowman basically became members of the squad. Again, repeating that there is no thing, so no official thing. The difference would be there is such a thing as the Freedom Caucus. That exists. It has this weird kind of public-private element to it where they don't tell you who the official members are.
Oh, really?
Yeah, really. And so it was weird when Marjorie Taylor Greene got kicked out because they had a vote and they kicked her out.
And that's when we found out she was in it.
People assume she's in it because, she's crazy. But it's you don't confirm or deny the existence and non-existence of members in it.
Oh, wow. It's like Skull and Bones.
It's totally bizarre. It's what are you doing here? Everybody knows who's in it. You guys talk publicly about it all the time. But at least it exists. They have meetings, they have bylaws. Squad doesn't have that. But politically speaking, it was very clear, Bush and Bowman became part of that. Then the next year, it becomes a little bit hazier. Greg Casar, who represents Austin. He would be asked during the race and he'd say, yeah, I consider myself that's a question that reporters would ask. He said, yeah, I support all of their general politics. Becca Balint, the Vermont congresswoman, she basically aligns with all their politics. Delia Ramirez, who represents Chicago and supported by very strong DSA and Working Families Party coalition out in Chicago. She aligns with all them. Summer Lee came in as a DSA candidate in 2018 to the Pennsylvania state legislature. I'd say she's a squad member. Now it's getting hazy. Now it's so big that if you have 10 or 12 members, but you're not meeting regularly and acting together, then you're not a squad.
But to be clear then, the original members of this unit who did see themselves as kind of a coherent unit made a decision then not to formalize this group, to create a kind of caucus, to create a kind of, I don't want to define it as progressive because there's already a congressional progressive caucus, but a kind of insurgent group where you're either in it or you're out of it. That was a path that they chose, I take it.
And AOC, after she won her primary, in an interview with Daniel Denver on his podcast, said, one of the problems with the Congressional Progressive Caucus is that it's just too big, too unwieldy, that there's no ideological litmus test. And as a result, it can't wield power internally. And maybe there ought to be a sub-caucus of members who are willing to hold the line. And that sent shivers through the Progressive Caucus. So what does that mean? Like, so there's going to be like an official kind of sub freedom caucus or whatever you would call it, dignity caucus, whatever you would call it on the left. And there was that nervousness that would develop and that it would drain some of the power away from, well, whatever power the Progressive Caucus had. And I don't know of them ever making a conscious decision not to do it, but they never made the decision to do it.
So just to be a little clearer on what we're talking about and what the dividing lines here are, why is it? What is the ideological split between, you take those original four, them and the rest of the Democratic Party, that makes them a phenomenon, that makes them something different and worth covering? As you say, there's a progressive caucus, so there's a lot of Democrats in Congress who describe themselves as progressive, and then AOC and Ilhan Omar describe themselves as progressive. What is the difference that makes them a phenomenon in Congress worth discussing?
The Progressive Caucus flirted with the idea of voting against the party, say during the first 2 years of the Obama administration. They said, if you don't have, public option or what, other demands in the Affordable Care Act, then we're going to vote no. We're going to use our power to vote no. So they flirted with that idea. They eventually capitulated in the end. But in general, the Progressive Caucus was never situated as adversarial to the party leadership in the way that the Freedom Caucus is to the Republican Party leadership. Mm-hmm. And so when Bernie Sanders ran against the Clinton machine in 2015, 2016, it created space inside the party for this element that was not just kind of more progressive. Like, if the mainstream Democratic line were for a public option, then the Bernie line was no, Medicare for all and ban private insurance. If Democrats were saying we need to get off fossil fuels by 2050, Bernie would say, no, we need to get off by 2030. Whatever the difference in degrees were. But the difference in kind was his willingness to challenge the party leadership for power. And that came about by accident, because he didn't really do it on purpose. Like, he ran a messaging campaign where he was trying to make sure that his kind of agenda was part of the debate. And he kind of accidentally found himself against this feeble candidate within striking distance of actually winning. And so then his campaign, like in real time, in the air, transforms from a messaging campaign to one that is actually now seeking power. And when the squad comes 2 years later, they are seen as challenging for actual power and be willing to be critical of the kind of willingness of Democratic Party leadership to challenge Trump or to challenge the corporate power. It's kind of a tactical distinction in that sense.
Yeah. Well, and certainly when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is first elected, that is certainly an accurate perception of her posture, because she's literally running against, one of the highest ranking members of the party establishment. You can't say that she's not defined by her willingness to challenge them. But when the story becomes a lot more complicated, as you write about, once she gets into Congress and gets sat down and go, this is not how it works around here. You gotta be nice. You gotta get along with your colleagues.
Right, and you don't have to like that. There's no rules that say you have to. Ron Paul decided never to do that for the most part. He was just going to vote no on everything. But I spent a lot of time in the book, as you noticed, I'm sure, on the first 6 months of that 2019 period, which is consumed on the one hand by fights over, Israel-Palestine and anti-Semitism and censure resolutions and on, but also by these conflicts with the party, with Nancy Pelosi calling them just 4 votes, and they've got their little, they're making a beautiful pate, but they're not actually accomplishing anything, and them kind of firing back. And you've got AOC's staff and Ilhan's staff to some degree as well, just completely unleashed in a way that had never happened before, and really it affects the dynamic inside the House, where you've got a chief of staff, a communications director, even a legislative aide, Riffle, just constantly popping off and calling out elected members of Congress by name, which never happened in history. Now, the history of social media is not very long, but you would never have had staff doing that in party papers in the 19th century or 20th century. This is staff who are behind the scenes, and now all of a sudden they're they're front and center and making these vocal criticisms. And Shroycott, her chief of staff, describes that as a deliberate strategy to kind of amplify their movement, because they recognized they were really only four, but they had so much visibility on social media that they could fight at parity or even better on social media against the Democratic leadership. And so allowing the staff to pop off, added to that. At the same time, though, AOC is also very publicly criticizing her party leadership at times, while also at the same time working to make a lot of friends among her new colleagues, because she sees that as essential to being a productive legislator within a two-party system and within kind of a Democratic Party that, when they're in the majority, like all legislation is going to have to run through the Democratic Party. And so for the first year, she really has kind of a foot in both of these strategic camps, and which blows up halfway through the year with Corbyn, her communications director, and Shroycott, being pushed out. And then you see work within the party more and use the progressive caucus rather than kind of a smaller kind of sub-angrier caucus.
Yeah, you quote here on page 143, you have a quote from Dan Riffle, where there's a big Twitter fight that erupts between Shroycott and a Democratic member of Congress, and he says, we're here to fight these fucking people, is his attitude. So they were delighted when there's a giant online conflagration. But then AOC herself is uncomfortable about it. Says, fight breaks out. Everyone's been preparing for a fight with the establishment, and then the fight breaks out. And she's like, I don't know about this. And then eventually, she comes in, as I say, as a warrior against the party establishment. But it seems like she gets a kind of cold feet about that when she's in Congress and pushes out these confrontational staff members.
Yeah, as Riffle would describe it in the book, he's like, look, I don't have to ride on the bus with these people to retreats. I don't have to go to brunch with them. I don't have to interface with them. So it's easier for me to relish these fights. And he, in that passage, he's talking not just about her, but about the entire squad, that there was a real kind of misunderstanding, not just among some of their supporters, but even among kind of her staff and some of the rest of the squad staff, of what their goal was in Congress. Like they really thought it was to spark, to trigger a big fight and to have it out and really go to war over the future direction of the party. And that was really what they came to understand, was that was not the strategic direction that they wanted to go in, that they wanted to go in a more somewhat confrontational, like lay out your principles, but then work well once you've kind of laid those out on the inside. It's just, that's what we got. That's who they were.
Tell us maybe a little bit more about how power works within the party in Congress, because when you get there as an anti-establishment member, Nancy Pelosi can, as I understand it, like draw you aside and go, look, whatever your rhetoric has been, you have an opportunity here. Do you want amendments? Do you want to be on committees? We're going to decide whether those things are true. And you now have a choice to make. Do you want to never get any of those things ever? Or do you want to play ball with us? That's kind of the impression that I get from reading the story that you tell here.
That's very much the argument that is made, and it's a bipartisan thing. Everybody confronts it. And the counter argument that Shroycott and Corbyn would make would be, first of all, they're lying to you. Like, you're never going to be in their good graces. You came in here by taking out Joe Crowley, the beloved Joe Crowley, next guy to be speaker, even though Pelosi was glad to see him beaten because he was presumed to be a rival of hers in the future for the gavel. The idea of coming in and knocking out a Democrat, verboten. The fact that she and the others continued to support primary challenges, even though they didn't support all of them, they didn't support many, they would still support upwards of, say, half a dozen challenges to incumbent Democrats. These are bad Democrats in deep blue districts who were not putting the party's majority remotely at risk. And so, the squad would think, well, we can endorse these and not rock the boat too much. But that wasn't true. Like, the principle that you don't come after an incumbent is one that all of these incumbents hold extremely dear. So the one argument that Corbyn Shroycott would make, like, nothing you do, you can't make yourself small enough. You can't be a good enough team player to ever be allowed on this team because of how you came in and the threat that you represent. Just the fact that you have independent power Like you have a power base through your connection, your direct connection to the public, mediated both either through cable whenever she or the others wanted it, or through social media, means that they can't control you with the same levers that they have against most other members. So that makes you a threat, whether you're acting on those threats or even announcing those threats. Secondly, they would say, Donald Trump is president. Don't forget, their first term, Donald Trump is president. Like, what bills are you going to pass that Donald Trump is going to sign into law that you're going to be proud of, that somebody else couldn't do for you? Like the idea that at this moment, we're going to be able to use congressional legislative vehicles to like enact something useful socially is absurd because Trump is president.
Right. So if you're measuring the little things that are being dangled in front of you in terms of their consequences, okay, you can be on a committee.
Right. You get on a good committee, but the good committee is not going to do anything because Trump's president.
Right. It does seem like some of the times, I'm trying to recall the example where I went, it does seem like they're fighting for things that are mostly symbolic here or being offered things that aren't really that real.
Was it the 40% committee seat victory, maybe, or something like that? The Progressive Caucus in 20...
Oh, yes. Yeah, I remember this now.
Yeah, they negotiated with Pelosi because every year, even though there was this big thing around forced to vote and people said, use your leverage.
Wait, you're going to have to explain that because not all...
at this moment to get...
Sorry, not all of our listeners are going to know about that. So you got to tell them what that is.
2021, a group of kind of podcasters and YouTubers were like, Squad has leverage now because Pelosi needs their votes to become speaker. So they should demand a vote be forced on Medicare for all on the House floor. And out of that, some of them decided that they had discovered the kind of idea of using leverage when in fact, every 2 years, there's this fight over who becomes speaker and what rules get written to govern the House process for the next 2 years. And that's when all the horse trading happens. From the Blue Dogs, who are the right-wing faction of the caucus, all the way to the left, including individual members who want little things. Like, I want a new auditorium built at a university in my district. For that, I'll give you my vote for speaker. Or my ally is running for state senate, show up at a fundraiser for them. Like little things like that to bigger things. And what the Progressive Caucus decided to fight for was a change in PAYGO, which is a kind of rule around budgeting, which we can talk about if anybody's still awake at the end of it. But the other thing they said, we want progressives to be on what they call A committees, which are powerful. The other word for them is money committees, because they legislate and they have jurisdiction over industries with lots of money. And so typically you put right-wing Democrats on there who are in swing districts who would then use it to raise money from those industries, like deeply corrupt situation where you have like a host kind of shaping itself to the parasite and allow the parasite better to feast on it and in reverse off of it. And so Pelosi says, okay, you represent 40% of the caucus. You guys say you want 40% of the seats on these A committees. I grant you that. But because there was no litmus test to join the Progressive Caucus, you actually had a handful of Democrats who just straight up just signed papers and said, hey, I'm now in the Progressive Caucus. They didn't change their politics and they weren't committed to any agenda. But now their position on this money committee counted toward the quota that Pelosi had agreed to. So then it was 2 years later that they kind of reformed that. And they're like, okay, we need to put in some ideological litmus tests. We need to be smarter about what you ask for. So, it's all a process. But yeah, Pelosi kind of outsmarted them on that one.
As you look back on the last few years, do you feel there were missed opportunities to use whatever power that these insurgent squad members had to get things? I mean, as you mentioned, there's a group of podcasters and YouTubers who remain very upset that they did not withhold votes from Pelosi in exchange for some concessions. The demand that was made at the time was a vote on Medicare for all that was kind of destined to fail. But I saw other suggestions that maybe a commitment to not taking sides in certain races or something like that, something that actually might make a difference and could be gotten. Whether it's that point or whether it's another point, are there moments where you go like, gosh, given what you know about how power works in Congress, there was something that could have been gotten?
I think I even floated that as a suggestion at one point when there was still time to enact it. A lot of these ideas started being put forward like after Thanksgiving and into Christmas, after all of the negotiations had basically been hashed out. Like it was now that there was a push to say, okay, we'll reopen these negotiations and do it on the House floor rather than kind of behind the scenes like is typically done. And they kind of rejected that entire premise that you do it on the House floor. That would have been a good one, I think, to say the DCCC has to reform its rules. Like you can't blacklist consultants who work with challengers.
Oh, right. That's what they do now, didn't it? Yeah.
You have to be neutral because the Republicans have that policy. Like they're neutral when it comes to primaries. Like, so Democrats could do that as well. It's an interesting question of whether or not you could have kept together the ecosystem of the squad and that online energy that was behind Bernie and then behind the squad early, and what that would have looked like, say, in 2021 when you're pushing a legislative agenda, because the House in 2021 was following Twitter like relentlessly. Like that's where it was taking its cues. It doesn't anymore. Like that's over. That window is shut. But there was a moment where, and certainly during the American Rescue Plan, I write about how that actually pressured Joe Manchin into caving, like because Manchin saw and was told by Schumer, who was told by Jayapal, that if he pushed too hard, there was so much anger outside that the squad was going to vote no on the American Rescue Plan. And so he caves. So like that's the model where you have a credible amount of energy building on the outside that is putting pressure on a left flank, which then can go to leadership and say, I'd love to be with you, but look, I can't. Like I will be destroyed if I'm with you on this. And you cut unemployment benefits, you cut these stimulus checks. And they see that same energy. They hear it. They hear him hooting through the walls. And so they cave. And they're like, all right, fine. Like, you're right. That dissipated. Instead of like seeing that as a model, the failure to get the $15 minimum wage into that provision. And then this like frustrating complaint that the checks should have been $2,000 rather than $1,400 plus $600. That was it. Like from then on, like the squad was an enemy. And so that ability to create a synergy between the outside energy and on the inside kind of evaporated. But the problem was always there was no one directing it. The squad was not really taking a leadership position and like communicating directly with forces on the outside. And there was no Steve Bannon like figure. Like today on the right, Steve Bannon's got this like daily podcast where he will constantly have on members of the Freedom Caucus or other right-wing Republicans. And they will hash out upcoming strategy. Like they were doing it all through the McCarthy speaker vote. They continue to do it through this upcoming fight. And so what that does is it brings the kind of what they call them the posse, brings the posse inside the fight. They direct their anger then at moderate Republicans. But that doesn't exist on the left. Maybe you got to do it.
You're listening to the Current Affairs podcast from Current Affairs Magazine in New Orleans, Louisiana. Current Affairs is a registered 501c3 nonprofit organization, and we depend entirely on reader subscriptions and donations. You'll notice we have no ads, no mattresses, no recruiters, no sports betting. If you can help us in our mission to build independent progressive media, please visit currentaffairs.org/donate to make a donation, or currentaffairs.org/subscribe to subscribe to our beautiful print magazine. Thank you so much for supporting our work. Now, back to the program. I always find it a little bit surprising that I don't get reached out to at all by left-leaning politicians trying to like get stuff, amplified. We got a big audience of like lefty activist people. I've never once, they don't even send us press releases to like give us cues as to what they want us to be covering.
It's completely broken, and there doesn't seem to be any effort to build it either. And without that, you get the complaints from AOC and others, that legitimate complaints that they're only hearing strategic ideas from the outside after the fact, like actual Monday morning quarterbacking. Like you should have run the ball, you should have. But somebody's got to change that. And if they are not really willing to, reach out to your podcast or otherwise, participate in that project, like Bannon's thing doesn't work if these Republicans don't come on. But because they've built this symbiosis, it doesn't mean it's working for them. Like Now they're making a lot of money selling a lot of gold to their like Bitcoin IRA assessment. But
although Trump's probably going to be president again. So.
Yeah, and they got Mike Johnson as speaker. That's not nothing. He's as right wing a speaker as you've had since before the Civil War.
They're going to have a bunch of lunatics and a bunch of positions of power. People should read your book if they want to understand kind of the grubby side of Washington. I do feel like a lot of cynics are going to be confirmed in some things. I'm thinking particularly, I just opened to the I think one of my really dispiriting ones was reading about the thing about the Hyde Amendment, where all these idealists come in and the AOC staff, and they're like, oh, let's have a vote to get the Hyde Amendment out of this bill. And then they're sat down by the insiders who go like, no, we don't do that around here. It's crazy. It's like a crazy moment.
That was such a crazy moment. And for people who don't know, the Hyde Amendment is a provision that's been in federal law for many, many years that basically says you can't spend federal money on abortion services. That was like the compromise position that Congress reached decades ago. And on the outside, it is anathema to the Democrats. Right as this was happening, by coincidence, like Joe Biden was getting pummeled by pro-choice groups, and eventually, within days of the pummeling, capitulates and says, the Hyde Amendment is wrong. I was wrong to support it. Mm-hmm. As president, I will repeal it. And by that point, every single Democratic presidential candidate is against the Hyde Amendment, which reminded me also that basically every presidential candidate except for Biden was for Medicare for all. Most of them were for banning private insurance. And in the House at the time, the Ways and Means Committee was having a hard time even passing legislation to let Medicare negotiate with pharmaceutical drugs. So the difference between what Democrats were saying to voters publicly they support Medicare for all and what they were able to do in the House, just allow Medicare to negotiate a few drug prices and stumbling their way through that. It was stark. But yeah, the Hyde Amendment, AOC tells her staff, let's look for things in the spending bill that we can, participate in legislatively. And her aides find, maybe this is a mistake. The Democrats are in control in the House, yet the Hyde Amendment is still in here. Right. The great champion of abortion rights is the House Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, clearly. And so they call the committee we're this is, by the way, just wanted to make sure it was still in there, but we're going to take it out. And they're like, exactly, to your point. They're like, yeah, about that. And so, yeah, she hears from Rosa DeLauro, one of the great champions of abortion rights, Planned Parenthood, NARAL.
Yeah, they were surprised to learn that that Planned Parenthood did not want Democrats to try to remove the Hyde Amendment. Why?
So the argument is that would force Democrats in swing districts to cast a vote that would allow federal money to be used for abortion services. And they would say, they told the office, well, we would have to score that vote because it's such an important vote. It's because publicly we claim that this is something that we want to achieve. So if there's a vote on the floor, we would score it. And what that means is if a Democrat voted no on it, they would get a bad score. So now instead of getting a 100% rating from Planned Parenthood, they have a 75% rating, or they have a B or a C, or whatever it is. That hurts them when it comes to fundraising. And if they vote according to them, and then if they vote yes on it, they were worried they'll get hit by the Republicans in the swing districts as supporting using federal money to support abortion services, which they believed then would be politically risky. And they say there's no point. It's not going to get through the Senate anyway. Trump's not going to sign it into law. So you'd be taking this vote that would complicate everybody's life for no actual material gain for anybody. And the way that we actually get it done is we have to have Democrats control the House, the Senate, and the White House. And then we'll be able to accomplish this. And what you're doing is getting in the way of it. So that was the rationale that they were given. And AOC staff were like, okay, but let's just have a vote on it. How about this crazy idea? And their argument too is they believed that even if you wanted to make all those cynical political calculations, that the calculations were wrong, that actually supporting abortion rights is popular in swing districts now, because swing districts they're less the 90s and 2000s era, more rural areas where Democrats were still competitive. There were now suburban districts that were swinging. and that forcing Republicans to have a fight over abortion actually would benefit Democrats.
Right.
And I think the time since then has absolutely vindicated that, like times 10.
Right. So there's a lot of arguments that are like, here's why we can't do anything. And it's like, well, actually, you might be able to do something. And also, this is wrong.
Right. Even on your own terms is wrong. Yeah.
Right. In many ways, this is a kind of depressing story because you get all these, energetic idealists coming into Congress and then just running up against the giant wall of the establishment and finding they can't do very much. You actually kind of have some insight into her thinking. But you say here that her curse was her desire to win consensus and persuade her colleagues she was there to help, coupled with her radical politics. She wanted to remake the system and be thanked for doing it, taking any resistance as a personal challenge. She seems to both, on principle, believe that it's really, really important to call out Democrats who vote for and support terrible things, but also not want to alienate herself from her colleagues entirely and actually succeed at things. And it seems like this is a paradox that she's never managed to, a circle she's never managed to square.
Well, and I think part of it is she very much took Democrats seriously when they would say they supported something. And so she would say, okay, you guys say you support repealing the Hyde Amendment, for instance. What I'm doing is showing you the way to repeal the Hyde Amendment and pointing out to you the people who are in the way of repealing the Hyde Amendment, like Dan Lipinski, anti-choice Democrat who she did help oust in 2020. And so she's like, how can you hold that against me? Like, we are all here to accomplish this agenda. These people are in the way of it, not me. I'm the one that wants it accomplished. So I'm showing you the path forward. Like, how is that a bad thing? And I think, within several years, she learned an awful lot about the way the institution works and is like, oh, okay, they're actually all in it to repeal the Hyde Amendment and to accomplish the agenda. The agenda is a thing that we talk about toward the maintenance of power. And so the analysis that she had in the first 6 months of being a member of Congress compared to the analysis she has now is markedly different.
Well, she should bring the combative stuff back then.
Yeah, because in some ways it's like there's some vindication for that. On the other hand, the whole hold the line fight was interesting in 2021, where they did kind of get the band back together and had a lot of outside kind of online support for a growing number of Democrats who were telling Biden, we're supporting Biden. That's the difference between Republicans and Democrats. The Progressive Caucus and the Squad always couched their support of Build Back Better as Biden's agenda. Like, we're the ones fighting for Biden's agenda. Because at the time, Biden was still popular, was still popular among Democrats. Now I think he's lost basically everybody. But they'd say it's Josh Gottheimer and these other right-wing Democrats who are undermining your agenda. We're actually supporting your agenda. Whereas on the Republican side, Republicans are always running against the Republican establishment, even though it's the Republican establishment is kind of made up at this point. Like, there is no Republican establishment. That's what I think, which is one reason I think they can trash talk it so much. Like, it's been thoroughly destroyed by MAGA. And so you can say you're against this thing without thing even existing and having any power to fight back at you. It's like Mitt Romney, that's who you're trash talking. Like, what's he going to do to you?
I got two more questions that I wanted to ask you while you're here, because I want your insight on them. The first is, how real and significant is the actual effect of the Israel lobby in Congress? Because you discuss, it comes up in your book, and there's an interesting kind of argument on the left as to how important the actual Israel lobby is versus, is it ideology or is it the actual influence of this interest group that threatens people? What's your take on the extent to which the institutionalized support for Israel can actually affect what people do in the legislature?
I think if you look at the timeline in the 1970s and 80s, before the pro-Israel lobby really took off, it was taking off in the early 1980s, you had a lot of Democrats who were pro-Palestinian rights, and you had even a significant number of Republicans, who were supportive of Palestinian rights. And you compare that to, let's say, 2016, where you have virtually none. And when you had the Obama administration kind of take on both the pro-Israel lobby and Israel to pass the Iran nuclear deal, they did so in the face of like enormous opposition from Democrats in the House who were still tightly allied with Israel. To the extent that they were complicit in bringing Netanyahu over to the House. Like they were like a lot of them went to watch Netanyahu address a joint session of Congress to oppose the Iran nuclear deal, the president's highest foreign policy priority, against the like wishes of the president of the United States. Like just an absolutely extraordinary breach of the way that things are done. That I think there shows that the strength of it. In 2022, AIPAC itself finally launched a super PAC, which came after the Democratic Majority for Israel, DMFI, won in 2020. And that really cemented the influence of the pro-Israel lobby, where you would have candidates in races across the country who weren't seeing a dime in spending from AIPAC or DMFI altering their public positions on Israel-Palestine just to stay under their radar, to stay on their good side. And certainly the races where they did spend money, they really shaped kind of what was possible inside the House. Their highest profile victory was probably against Nina Turner, who was 30 to 40 points up. Without that intervention, a last minute, she wins. They almost beat Summer Lee. They beat Donna Edwards, who was a skeptic of Israel. Nida Alam, like a significant number of other Democrats that would be in Congress, like voicing public opposition to what's going on now, are not there, and others were kind of muzzled and shifted on the issue.
Last thing I just wanted to get from you I have you, is your take on how fucked Joe Biden is. I've seen the headline over and over, Joe Biden's approval rating reaches a new low, and there doesn't seem to be any end to the number of times that headline can be produced. And yet, the cover story of New York Magazine this month is about how the Biden campaign are pretty untroubled and unfazed by all of this. And every time I feel like, man, this looks like a real disaster, I am assured that the election is a long time away and a lot of stuff can be turned around, and maybe there's a secret plan. You're a Washington insider. Is there a secret plan? Are people more panicked in private than they are in public?
The secret plan was revealed publicly by Ron Klain, Biden's former chief of staff, several years ago. You remember when Macron won re-election a couple years ago? Ron Klain tweeted, "Look at that. An incumbent with a 30% approval rating just won re-election. Told you it's possible." The strategy is that Trump is like Marine Le Pen, that everybody hates Trump. And if you force voters to choose between those two, that what they call the double haters who hate both will break for Biden. That's their theory. The double haters in 2016 who hated both Hillary and Trump broke for Trump. The double haters in 2020 who hated them both, they broke for Biden. Difference, of course, this time, we'll see if Cornel West or Jill Stein get any ballot access or any traction. You'll have RFK Jr. potentially on a lot of these ballots. And maybe you get a Joe Manchin. No Labels is a huge part of this book too, representing kind of hedge fund and private equity money. So there could be options at this time. So it will be harder for Democrats to force the straight up referendum on MAGA. Like Democrats in DC very much believe that the data shows that if the election is a referendum on Trump and MAGA, that MAGA loses no matter what. Like that's how confident they are. That's why they would put up Joe Biden at this stage. The funny thing is, Biden could win. He could also lose, but I think there are too many people think that Biden has a 0% chance of re-election. I don't think that's right. I think it's practically a coin toss. But I also think some Democrats are estimating.
But God, what a risky thing to pin it on.
Jesus, man. Like, yes, there are assertions that they really care deeply about democracy and that, like, if they lose, democracy is finished, are not borne out by their willingness to put this guy into the ring as the champion.
We're confident that if it's a referendum on MAGA, you could give people no promises. You could give them an incredibly unpopular, old, feeble man, and it wouldn't make a difference.
Can't string together sentences. Who's
like, not allowed to speak publicly after 5 p.m.
Yeah, that's a lot of confidence.
Yeah, I always wonder, and I want to take advantage of the opportunity to talk to you. I always think, what do people know in private in DC that they don't say publicly?
But that's basically it. And yeah, Biden is doing everything he can to denude that argument. He tried to do an immigration crackdown. Looks like Republicans aren't going to let him because they'd rather have chaos that they can point to. He's backing 2 wars that are but spiraling out of control, saber rattling around Taiwan. So the rationale to be anti-MAGA, they keep knocking the different legs out from underneath.
Yeah. Well, Hamilton Miller wrote a great thing, like, don't make voters step over a pile of corpses to vote for you. Like, you better hope that like they're willing to step over the pile of corpses now. Have you noticed, am I wrong that Trump has been quite quiet on Israel-Palestine? Very
quiet. Very, very quiet. He recognizes that there's no political upside for him getting involved in it, because if he says anything mildly critical of Israel, he loses a lot of kind of right-wing support. But he also doesn't want to get in the way of Biden while he's making a mistake, which I think that's a Napoleon quote, like, don't get in the way of your opponent when he's making a mistake. And so he wants this crisis, this war, this genocide to drag Biden down as much as possible without him having to be associated with it.
Yeah. Suddenly I realized that I hadn't heard anything on it coming out of Trump, and I thought, God, that's clever.
Right. He sees where this is going. That's the funny thing. That it seems quite clear that Netanyahu, likes Trump, wanted Trump to win in 2016, would love Trump to win re-election. But I think Netanyahu better be careful what he wishes for, because Trump is the most cynical man on the planet. And the second that Netanyahu or Israel are not an advantage to him, let alone a political disadvantage, he'll cut them loose faster than an F-16 can fly.
And I actually feel like he would be almost less likely to do what Biden's doing, which is just letting Netanyahu like walk all over him and keep sending the bombs.
Yeah, he's not taking a political heat for anybody.
Right. Okay, well, thank you so much, Ryan Grimm. There's so much in the book. The book is so rich with reminders of the history of the last few years. I'm so glad that you've written this history, because it's so easy to forget a lot of this stuff 5 minutes after it happens. You cover the Sanders-Warren fight. You cover, Biden actually becoming president the first time. You cover all the Build Back Better fights. So, there's so much that we couldn't get to today, but that's why people need to pick up your new book, The Squad, AOC, and the Hope of a Political Revolution, because it isn't just about AOC. It's really a rich history of the past few years of democratic politics. So anyone who wants to understand our present moment probably ought to read it. So thank you so much.
Yeah, I try to make it a romp. I try to make it fun.
It's colorful. A lot of good characters in it. A lot of great quotes. I was underlining quotes all through. You got people to say some things that I would imagine some of them wonder whether they should have said after the
fact. Right. That's what you want. Yeah.
Well, it's a great book. It's available now from Holt. Ryan Grimm of The Intercept, thank you for joining us on Current Affairs today.
Thank you, sir.
The Current Affairs Podcast is a product of Current Affairs Magazine. If you are not subscribed to Current Affairs Magazine, visit currentaffairs.org/subscribe today and get our glorious print edition. The Current Affairs Podcast is released regularly every week on patreon.com/currentaffairs. Thanks for listening.